Before the engineers, before the bulldozers, before the concrete that violated its ancient heart, Monte Toc knew its own destiny. It was a living mountain, fragile, ancient, a creature of stone that for centuries had held the memory of old landslides in its very veins, of movements both slow and devastatingly powerful. The mountain knew, but no one chose to listen. On October 9th, 1963, its cry tore through the valley. At 10:39 in the evening, the earth gave way. A landslide of 270 million cubic meters sheared from the face of Monte Toc, plunging into the artificial basin of the Vajont Dam. In mere seconds, a colossal wave was born. It vaulted over the dam as if it were a pebble in a stream and fell upon the valley below. Longarone, Pirago, Fai, Rivalta, Villanova. Entire towns were erased from existence. More than 1,900 people perished in a matter of minutes. In the 1950s, the Vajont Valley was a remote world, built of silence, labor, and tradition. The villages of Erto and Casso lived in a quiet harmony with the mountains. Their people led a hard life, but one steeped in dignity. The land was spare, but the community was strong. Men cut timber and led their livestock to pasture, building their world with their own hands. Women ran the households, mended clothes, and told stories by the fire at night. Children ran free in the woods, climbing the rocks, drinking cool water from the streams. In this tough and honest land, the seasons alone dictated the rhythm of life. Winter was long and frozen. Summer was brief but lush. Feast days were cherished events. A wedding involved the entire village. Religious processions united faith and community. It was a mountain civilization, proud, resilient, and complete. Then, the Adriatic Electric Camise of progress. A colossal dam, the tallest in Europe, would tame the waters and generate power for the industry of northern Italy. Engineer Carlo Semenza was the father of the project. The structure, built between 1957 and 1960, was hailed as a masterpiece of engineering. But even then, Monte Toc was giving unsettling signs. Eduardo Semenza, a geologist and the son of the chief engineer, discovered the mountain was unstable. He had studied the terrain. He had found the scars of ancient landslides. He had warned of the danger. His words were ignored. The economic interests were too great. Sade, fortified by the state's approval, pushed forward. The work continued without pause. The landscape began to transform. Bulldozers, concrete mixers, and trucks heavy with materials became the new inhabitants of the valley. Workers from all over Italy arrived, and the villages watched as their world was remade before their eyes. The silence was broken by the roar of explosions, blasting tunnels into the rock, carving a new future into a mountain that had already decided its own. The water of the Vajont was to be tamed, channeled, harnessed, and reduced to a series of calculations on a page. But by 1960, the earth began to speak. The alarms started not with sirens, but with the fracturing of homes in the village of Erto. A deep-seated fear took hold of the people as the very ground beneath their feet began to tremble. Workers, sensing the danger, refused to go near the site. Technicians with their instruments measured a movement that was slow but relentless. The landslide had already begun. Each time the engineers raised the water level in the artificial lake, the mountain answered. It shifted. It groaned. And yet no one stopped the project. No one ordered the valley evacuated. On the 4th of November 1960, the mountain sent its first clear message. A section of the hillside slid into the reservoir. It was an unmistakable warning. The response was a silence born of arrogance. The engineers believed they had everything under control. Between 1960 and 1963, they manipulated the water levels, a dangerous experiment on a living mountain. But Monte Toc, the walking mountain, continued its slow, inexorable march. The inhabitants of the valley saw the signs the experts dismissed. Strange cracks spiderwebbed across their walls. Ancient trees began to tilt at impossible angles. Wells that had provided water for generations suddenly ran dry. With each passing day, the ground beneath them grew more fragile. A feeling grew in the villages, a certainty that something terrible was coming. October 9th, 1963. At 10 in the morning, the instruments confirmed the fear. The movement of the landslide was accelerating exponentially. Management in Rome was informed. The chief engineer ordered the lowering of the lake's water level to continue, a gesture that had been underway for days and was now utterly futile. No one sounded the alarm. No one ordered an evacuation. That evening, a heavy fog settled over the valley, muffling the world. In the town of Longorone, many gathered at the cinema, unaware. Children slept soundly in their beds. Families sat together in the warmth of their homes. At 10:39 in the evening, the mountain finally surrendered its hold. The roar tore through the night, a sound so immense it was heard miles away in Belluno. The landslide, 260 million cubic meters of rock and earth, moving at nearly 300 kilometers per hour, slammed into the man-made lake. The dam itself, a monument to human ingenuity, held firm. But the water it was meant to contain became the instrument of annihilation. A colossal wave, hundreds of feet high, crested the concrete wall and fell upon the valley below. In seconds, the town of Longorone was erased. The lights went out. Families were swallowed by a sudden, violent darkness. A wall of mud and debris swept over everything. There was no time to scream, no time to flee, no time to seek shelter. The sound of the water was the only voice left in the valley. The church bells were silenced forever. Trains were tossed. At the orphanage in Longorone, the children were sleeping. Not a single one survived. They would be found days later, some still locked in a final embrace. A firefighter who arrived on the scene would later recall the smell of iron and wet earth. He spoke of the nights that followed, of faint cries rising from the ruins, and the agonizing powerlessness of knowing that everything and everyone was buried. This was not a tragedy authored by nature alone. It was the final, devastating consequence of a dialogue where one side spoke in the shifting of the earth and the other replied with the deafening silence of ambition. It remains a testament to the cost of progress when it is deaf to the warnings of the world it seeks to conquer. In the hours that followed, the first rescue teams arrived. What they found was not a disaster scene. It was a theater of war. The town of Longorone had been erased from the earth. In its place, only mountains of rubble, the splintered skeletons of homes, clothing tangled in the skeletal branches of trees, the twisted carcasses of Otl. It was the only thing that remained. Medics erected field tents against the mud. The survivors were few, hollowed by shock, their voices stolen by what they had seen. They wandered through the ruin, searching for loved ones, not knowing where to dig or why. Some refused food, refused water. They wanted only to remain, to stand vigil beside the ghosts of their homes. The mass graves filled with a terrible speed. So many of the bodies were unrecognizable, their identities washed away by the flood. Relatives signed forms, exchanging a signature for a nameless tomb. Amid the grief, the authorities called for discretion, for silence, for order. The year was 1968 when the trial began. The defendants were few: executives from the Sade Energy Company, a handful of engineers. The court heard reports, testimonies, expert analyses, but in the end, the convictions were a whisper. The lead engineer received a sentence of 6 years. He served less than 2. The state never acknowledged its culpability. The tragedy was officially framed as a natural event, amplified by technical errors. But the documents, the reports, the letters dispatched long before the disaster tell a different story. A story of a tragedy announced, a catastrophe ignored, a risk that had been calculated. The families of the victims were granted compensation, 2 million lira for each life cut short. But no life could be rebuilt with money. Today, the memory of Vajont has transformed. It is not merely a commemoration, but a symbol of the cost of placing profit before safety, of ignoring the voice of the natural world, of silencing those who dare to speak a warning. Every 9th of October, they gather in Longarone for the ceremonies. The names of the victims are read aloud, a litany against forgetting. Descendants lay flowers. Some have built new lives. Others return each year in silence, their eyes fixed on the immovable face of Monte Toc. A museum now stands, housing letters, photographs, and small objects unearthed from the debris. And the dam is still there. An immense, untouched monolith of concrete, a silent giant dominating the gorge. It is no longer a monument to progress. It has become a monument to human failure, to technical arrogance. Its engineered solidity was utterly useless. The killer was the water that crested its wall, the wave that rendered the colossal structure irrelevant. Tourists and students visit it every year. Some stand in silence for long minutes. Others take photographs, their fingers tracing the names etched in stone. But to truly understand the pain consumed by this valley requires more than sight. It requires a story to be told, a memory to be kept alive. For Vajont is more than history. It is a perpetual lesson, a warning written not only for its victims, but for all who might believe themselves masters of a world that will never truly be tamed. Every grand design, every monument of concrete and steel, every dam that rises to hold back the waters, must carry within its foundations the ghost of Vajont. It is a solemn instruction, a permanent reminder that behind the cold arithmetic of progress, behind every calculation and every metric, there are faces, there are families, and there are dreams. For memory is not merely an act of looking back. It is the sacred duty we owe the future, a promise etched into the earth itself that what has been must never be again.